Hi everyone, welcome to my kitchen. I'm Brenda from Mainly Hybrid Homesteading, and as you can see, I'm in the middle of prepping some chicken for canning. I've been canning for about a year and really loving it. It's a great way to preserve your food for a longer storage, and especially if you're worried that we may lose power or, anything could happen and you could lose all the meat in your freezer. So this is a great way to just have it on the shelf, have it ready to go. You don't have to pre-cook it. It's already cooked for you. So this is lovingly called ugly chicken in the canning world, or raw packed chicken. So you can see I've been working on some jars here. We got some split chicken breasts for 99 cents a pound. And in here, I've got all the bones after I've trimmed off the meat. Going to be making some bone broth with that, so nothing is going to waste. So first, I like to remove the skin. And I am by no means a butcher or know what I'm doing in that department. But I usually try to grab the breast here. More fat. And then find that area where you're just separating it from the chicken tenders right here. So I've been focusing on stocking up on canned chicken lately because our dog Ellie is also eating chicken. It's healthier for her and also more inexpensive to feed her. So I'm just removing some of the excess fat and some tendons that I don't want in there. You want to start with everything has to be clean. Your jars have to be cleaned in hot soapy water before you start your work surface, nice and clean. So I'm just cutting these, like 1-inch cube pieces. You don't want like big chunks in there because the heat may not get all through that piece of meat. And then you'll have issues with bacteria and so forth. So for raw packed chicken, they recommend 1¼ inch headspace. The 1-inch mark is the lower ring here on the canning jar, and so like 1/4 inch below that. It used to be 1-inch headspace, but they recently changed it. So I am just packing it in there as I go. I was very intimidated starting to can. My mom never canned, and well, she did with water bath canning. And she did vegetables with that, which they don't recommend anymore, but that's the way they did it when she was growing up. So we're going to be pressure canning this meat today. You can do this with pork or beef. It's the same method. It's the same processing time. Always good to have a variety of meat in your pantry. Okay, so try to get that tender out of there. So trying to get as much as I can off of the bone. It's not going to hurt to have any little bits of chicken in the broth. It'll just add some flavor. So there is a tendon here in the chicken tender that I like to remove. Much easier to start with boneless, but I'm going for the economy of buying it this way. And then I get to have the bones for the bone broth. And we'll be canning that up as well. Bone broth is great for gut health. And it's great to help throw together an easy soup from your pantry. Just grab a jar of meat and some veggies. I like to use some dehydrated veggies. Big time saver. And yes, you are spending the time canning it. I prefer to use wide mouth jars. They're much easier to pack the meat in, although I have used the regular mouth jars. Just have to use a spoon or something to push down the meat so it's packed in there. And we're not going to add any liquid to this because the meat is going to make its own juice when it's cooking. Okay, now you can see me. Sorry about my head being cut off in the first segment of the video. It just trying my camera in a different direction and didn't quite work out. But at least you could see what I was doing. We have all our jars prepped now, and so we're going to be cleaning the rims of the jars. I have some vinegar here, and just going to be using a napkin, the corner of a napkin, and I usually make a couple passes just to get any little, and I flip over the napkin, that corner, and do another sweep. You could also use a clean cloth dipped in the vinegar. So we ended up with, I had about 20 pounds of the split chicken breast and ended up with about 13 jars, but there was meat left over, but not enough for another jar. So I did warm up my lids in some water. Ball says you don't have to do that anymore, but I find I'm having much better success with all of my jars sealing by warming them in the hot water. I think it softens up the, the silicone around the inner part of the lid. And if your jar doesn't seal, don't worry. You can either use it for a meal the next day, or sometimes I'll just throw it in the freezer in a Ziploc bag or a freezer safe container to throw in some soup later. Or you could always reprocess that jar, but I'm not gonna run my canner for another jar or two unless you're planning on doing another, you know, big canning the next day with something else that uses the same processing time as the chicken. So I just have my lids here. I just had them on low in to get the water hot and to get the lids warmed up. I have my 23 quart Presto canner here. And you can see inside the canner there's markings for water levels, and I have it, oh, I gotta add a little more water. You can see I need to, there's one, the lowest marking there. I don't think you can see it with the staining, but that's where your water level needs to be. And I also need to add, you don't want your jars right at the bottom of the canner, so just putting this tray that came with the canner. So some important tools that are very handy when you're canning are this jar lifter and little magnetic wand to help lift the lids out of the hot water, and this little spatula here has some markings on it to measure your headspace. So if you wanted a 1/4 inch, whatever the instructions call for, that's what you're going to follow, because you want to be safe when you're canning. And it's also handy for removing bubbles when you are canning with something that you're putting liquid in. You want to make sure all the air bubbles get out, because if you don't, then the bubbles will displace the liquid in the jar and your headspace will be off. So we are just putting our lids on here, and you don't want to crank it on as tight as you can. Usually I just, until it starts to tighten up a little bit, that's where I'll stop. It's really a subjective, I feel it's a subjective, you know, what finger tight is. But that's how I do it. And then we put it in our canner. You just don't want it to be too tight. Then you want to allow steam to escape from under the lid while the chicken is cooking, and not causing too much pressure inside the jar. So now I have filled the bottom of my canner, and so I'm not going to want to rest the other jars on top, directly on top of these jars. So I'm going to put another shelf here, and I did have to buy this separately because my canner only came with one shelf. So my canner is a 23 quart Presto canner, and very pleased with this. It runs about $120, and so we pretty much filled our canner. The bottom is full, and the top is, we could probably had 3 more jars in there. So now we're going to put the lid on. So I already put my gauge on there. You want to make sure that your vent is not clogged from the last canning session, and that your pressure relief valve here is moving freely. So with the Presto, you do have an arrow on the handle of the actual canner and an arrow on the cover. So you line those up, and that's it. So we're going to put this on high to get it boiling. So I had to figure out, this is not my biggest burner on my stove. This one is, and I had to figure, I just had a hard time controlling the pressure on the bigger burner. So you'll have to figure out what works better for you as far as your stove and your temperature controls. So we'll get this back, we'll get this up to boiling, and then I'll show you the next step and what I use for my weight instead of the weight that came with the canner. So I don't know if you can see the steam coming out of the canner here. We've got a steady stream of steam. So we are going to set our timer for 10 minutes. So while the canner is venting for 10 minutes, I wanted to show you what I use instead of the pressure regulator that came with the canner. So this is the pressure regulator that came with the canner. It just goes on the vent, and then you have to watch it. And I guess that's the part I was nervous about or didn't like. We're just under 1,000 feet above sea level, so we have to use 11 pounds of pressure for pressure canning. And I found that I was always fiddling with the flame on the stove to try to keep it in that range, and I just didn't like it. I mean, before I started pressure canning, no one in my family had pressure canned, and the only stories I had heard was my husband's, my father-in-law was pressure canning beans, and they ended up on the ceiling in the camp. So I didn't want that happening here. So at any rate, I was watching Lisa from Sutton's Days, and she uses the Jiggler, which is what I purchased. It comes in 3 pieces. So just this part is for 5 pounds of pressure, and then you add another weight, and then you have 10 pounds. And then if for your altitude you need 15 pounds of pressure, then you can add the second ring. And these are the instructions. So for low acid foods like vegetables and meat, you're going to use 10 pounds of pressure for altitudes up to 1,000 feet. So I use the initial one plus a 5-pound one. And then if you're above 1,000 feet, you would use all 3. You'd use 15 pounds. And then it goes on for fruits and stuff like that. But you'll see that this is super easy. Once you put on, I can hear it, and, no matter where I am in the house, and if it's just jiggling at that right pace, then I don't have to worry about it. And I know it hasn't stopped jiggling. It hasn't lost pressure. It's just coasting along until your processing time is done. So our timer just went off, and so we're going to put our Jiggler on. I have my dish gloves on here because there's hot steam coming out of here, and first couple times I just freaked out. I tried to put it on there quickly, and it dropped under the grates where the burner is, and it was just a mess. So I use my gloves. I don't have to worry about getting burnt. So we're not going to start the timer yet. We're going to wait till the Jiggler starts jiggling, and then we'll start our processing time. Okay, so our Jiggler is wiggling, and this is about how fast you want it. Maybe a little bit faster. I haven't turned the heat down yet. So all this time I've had it on high. So my sweet spot on my stove is like that first setting after low. It's certainly probably different with your stove. So this is about how fast you want it jiggling. We're not going to pay attention at all to the actual pressure gauge, but if you are using the weight that came with the Presto canner, then yes, you are going to keep an eye on the pressure gauge, and according to your elevation, what the recommended level is. So I'm going to put this in for 75 minutes for pints. That's the recommended time for chicken without bones. If you have bones, like you're doing thighs with the bone in, then it would be 65 minutes. This is the booklet that came with the canner, and there are great instructions here on most things that you do want to can. But if you need a good basic canning book, this is by the USDA, and great simple instructions on anything you want to can, things that you shouldn't be canning, and there's recipes in there as well. I will leave a link down below to the Jiggler and all these things, and the Jiggler is made for Presto canners only, and then it lists, you know, which Presto canners you can use it with. I don't know if they make one for other canners, but something worth looking into if you want to try one. So our 75 minutes is up, and I've turned off the heat under my canner, and it's recommended that you take it off of the heat source. So I'm not strong enough to totally lift the canner, especially when it's full, but I do my best to kind of gently slide it over or shimmy it over. If you're using a glass top stove, first of all, you need to make sure that it can take the weight of your canner when it's full. And if it's recommended that you can use canners on that glass top. But if you have a glass top that is able to have a canner on it, then you don't want to be like sliding it across, because you may scratch that surface. But at any rate, we're going to get it off of this burner. And yeah, I don't want to move it too much because I have those jars on the top that, you know, it's not completely packed in there. So not going to touch anything right now. Just going to wait for the pressure to come down to 0, and then we'll bring you back. Okay, so our chicken has cooled off down to 0. And all I'm going to do right now is remove the jiggler. And then I will come back in about 10 minutes, and we will just crack the lid open a little bit. So just going to loosen the cover on the canner. We're just releasing any pressure that might be left in there. So that's it. Just going to leave it alone for another few minutes. So our canner has continued to cool off. And just going to remove the cover away from you. And that's always a beautiful sound. The jar is sealing already. These are still boiling. I'm putting these on a towel. You don't want to put them on a cool surface and have the jars break on you, especially at this point. And we are going to let these cool overnight, and we'll check the seals in the morning. Welcome back. It's the next morning, and we have not touched the jars. Just, you got to leave them alone for 12 hours, let them cool down. And I did remove the rings this morning, and we're just going to check the seals on all of these. They look, at first glance, they look like they've all sealed. They're all sunken in. And there's 2 ways you can check to see if they made a seal. Usually it just make sure they all sound the same. This one's going to sound a little different because it's a regular mouth. But we're also going to be lifting them up, making sure a seal was made. So like I said, I've had great success warming up my lids prior to canning. Okay, they're all good. So now we're going to wash them in some warm soapy water. So this is just another time to be inspecting your lids. You're just going to wash around the rim and wash the jar. You don't want any, if there's any juices that may have leaked out during the canning process, you don't want that to be causing bacteria to grow on your jars. Okay, and we're just going to rinse them, let them dry, and then I am going to label them with the date that they were canned and put them in a cool, dark place, and they should last for quite a few years. The ball company says 18 months. I've heard on other channels 5 to 10 years. I think the biggest thing is to inspect your jars routinely, make sure the seals are still intact, and make sure, you know, nothing looks discolored. Any meat above the water line will look a little discolored, but that, you know, as long as your jar looks fine, it's okay. So I hope this video was helpful for you. I know it can be intimidating to start canning if you've never done it before. And I'm really glad that I went ahead and tried it. It's a great way to preserve foods, especially if you're worried about power outages and you don't want to have all of your meat in your freezer. You want to have some shelf-stable meats available and they're already cooked. You can add it to casseroles, soups, stir fries. It comes out really, really tender this way. And we've both been enjoying it, and our puppy has been too. Thanks for joining us today. Please like and share this video and subscribe if you haven't already done so. We'll see you next time. Bye.